The objectives are to discuss the etiologies implicated in sudden death in athletes. I will try to outline the novelties in the field. I will describe the St. George's University sudden death database, and I will try to discuss sudden cardiac death in female athletes. So first of all, we all know that sudden death in athletes is a tragic but rare event. But if we're asked how rare it is, we understand that it's very difficult to answer to this question because there are various cohorts, various studies with different numbers. And we have numbers ranging from 1 in 5,000 athletes per year to 1 in 300,000 athletes per year. So there is an extreme variability according to the cohort studied. And this variability is expressed and is reflected also in the etiologies of sudden cardiac death in athletes. And I'm sure that the majority of you know this pie chart that derives from Dr. Maron's group studies that were published in JAMA in 1996 and in Circulation 2009, studies on a big cohort of sudden death victims, were studies not on autopsies but on death certificates. And we learned from these studies that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the most common cause of sudden death in athletes. However, most recent studies have in some way debated with this idea, and I will start from this study published in JACC more than 10 years ago from Professor Gherardo's group, and this study showed us that arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy instead is the most common cause of sudden death in athletes. This is a study recently published in Circulation. It is a study from the United States. It's a national effort that has a leading center, the Seattle group. And it was a study on young college athletes, so NCAA athletes, aged between 19 and 23. And we see that in this cohort, sudden unexplained death, which means a normal heart at the post-mortem, also called as sudden adult death syndrome, was the most common cause of sudden death. And hypertrophic cardiomyopathy accounted for only 8% of the cases. There are also other studies that are within the same line that I will not show for brevity, but I think that what we learn, especially from recent experiences, is that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy doesn't equate to sudden cardiac death in athletes. But in reality, sudden cardiac death in athletes is a conundrum of various etiologies where often the post-mortem examination is not easy. And we have etiologies as arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, normal heart at the post-mortem, so sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is probably not the most common cause of sudden death. So in the next few slides, I will show you our CRY experience. And the results of this study have been recently published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And with this study, we try to investigate the causes and circumstances of sudden cardiac death in a large cohort of athletes. And what is most important is all our cases were reported by an expert cardiopathologist, by Professor Mary Shepherd. And we try to report also on the contribution of relatively novel entities such as idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy and idiopathic fibrosis. So when there is a sudden unexpected cardiac death in the United Kingdom, the case goes to the attention of the local pathologist who can refer the case to our CRY Cardiac Pathology Center, which is an internationally recognized cardiac pathology in the UK, and we receive more than 500 cases per year. And in the last 20 years, we were able to collect more than 3,500 cases. Out of these, 357 were athletes, 69% competitive athletes, 31% recreational athletes. And these are the etiologies of sudden death. In the overall population, we see that 42% of the cases were sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, so a normal heart at the post-mortem, followed by idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy and idiopathic fibrosis in 16% of the cases, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy in 13%, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in 6%. And if we look at various age subgroups, we see that younger athletes, so less than 18 years old, there is an absolute prevalence of sudden arrhythmia death syndrome, so a normal heart attack post-mortem. Well, if we look at older subgroups, we see that there is an increasing proportion of cardiomyopathies. And this study has been, the result of this study has been in some way confirmed by this study published on New England Journal of Medicine. This is an Australian national effort which analyzed sudden death, not necessarily in athletes, but just in young individuals. And what the investigators found is that in 40% of the cases, sudden death is unexplained. This slide has two important messages. The first on the left, to die suddenly to be an athlete doesn't equate to die on the pitch, but in 61% of the cases there was a sudden death during exercise, but remarkably in 40% of the cases sudden death occurred at rest or even asleep. The second point is that there is an association between certain variables and certain etiologies and exercise-induced sudden cardiac death. And in particular, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy was associated with a six-fold increase with exercise-induced sudden cardiac death. In conclusion, conditions predisposing to sudden cardiac death in sport demonstrate a significant age predilection. In fact, young individuals tend to die more frequently because of sudden arrhythmia death syndrome, while cardiomyopathy seem to predominate with increasing age. Although the majority of athletes die during exertion, almost 40% die at rest. There is a strong association between arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy and exercise-induced sudden cardiac death. There is a high prevalence of idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy and fibrosis, and this underscores the need for further research in the field to delineate their exact significance. A second main topic of our research was to try to answer to these two main questions. So, why sudden death is more common in male athletes, and what is the effect of gender on athletes' heart? And we know that the majority of the studies on the effect of cardiac adaptation to exercise is on male athletes, but there is an increasing increasing proportion of females engaged in sport, even at a very high level, as it is outlined by this histogram, which shows the proportion of female participants at the Olympic Games. And we see that in 2012, almost 50% were females. So we try to address these questions with two parallel studies. We try to look at sudden death victims, female athletes, and we try to look at echocardiographies, in particular at the left ventricular geometry in elite athletes, comparing males versus females. So we know that sudden death is much more frequent in males, in male athletes, and we have a ratio of males to females of 10:1. So with this study, we try to focus in particular on 27 female athletes that die suddenly, 8% of the total cohort. And we take a look at the etiologies of sudden death in athletes, and we see that sudden arrhythmia death syndrome was more frequent in female athletes. Instead, cardiomyopathies were more frequent in male athletes. And if we look more closely, we see that idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy, in other words, a heavy and thick heart without myocardial disarray, was observed only in male athletes, not in females. And if we look at the heart weight and we compare it with a normal cohort, so an autopsy-derived cohort of people, of patients that died not because of cardiac disease, we see that there is an increased heart weight in male athletes, but we didn't observe this increased heart weight in female athletes. And we looked at echocardiographies and left ventricular geometry in males and females athletes, and we found, I think, two interesting things. The first is that in 70% of elite athletes, there is a normal left ventricular geometry. But if we look at the proportion of athletes that had an abnormal left ventricular geometry, in other words, a remodeling induced by long-term exercise, we see that there is an important effect of gender on the way on the cardiac remodeling in athletes. In particular, it is very rare to observe a concentric hypertrophy or concentric remodeling in female athletes, which tend to develop more frequently eccentric hypertrophy, while it is quite common to see concentric hypertrophy and concentric remodeling in male athletes. In other words, we understand that there are differences. There is an important effect of gender in left ventricular cardiac remodeling, left ventricular geometry in athletes. Females, more frequently eccentric hypertrophy, males, concentric hypertrophy, concentric remodeling. How all this translates in the striking higher prevalence of males in sudden death victims cohort is still unknown, because it goes back to a main question. So what is idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy? Is that just a pathological variant of physiological left ventricular hypertrophy? Is that part of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy spectrum? Is that a trigger for fatal arrhythmias in the individuals with an underlying arrhythmogenic syndrome, or it is just an innocent bystander? And so far, we don't have an answer to this question. And what we are trying to do now is, first of all, to try to compare sudden death victims with a postmortem finding of idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and to look at the clinical and histopathological differences. And the future direction, and it is the main object of my research at the moment, is to screen the families of sudden death victims with a postmortem finding of idiopathic left ventricular hypertrophy, and we are trying to investigate these individuals with a comprehensive diagnostic workup, including ECG, echocardiogram, MRI, exercise test, 24-hour Holter, to rule out hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And then we look also at, we investigate them also with a National test to rule out Brugada syndrome. And then if there is a cardiomyopathy or a channelopathy, we perform a genetic test. Thanks for your attention.